Jazz is a genre of music developed from ragtime blues and artistic improvisation. It was the most influential type of American music in the 1920s.
Storyville, New Orleans, or the Red Light District, is considered the birthplace of jazz music. People attribute jazz's early development in New Orleans to the legendary Charles Bolden, a renowned cornetist who played music in New Orleans. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, he traveled from place to place, entertaining people with his upbeat tunes. The reason jazz was such a hit among his listeners was because this combination of ragtime, blues, and improvisational music allowed people to dance. One of the main reasons jazz music continued to flourish in New Orleans was because of the busy urban lifestyle of the booming city. There was no shortage of nightclubs or other forms of entertainment in the city, and where there were clubs, there was jazz music. Where there was jazz music, there was dancing. Dancing achieved widespread popularity because of the opportunities that jazz music offered it. During the late 1910s and the 1920s, Chicago became the destination of many famous jazz musicians. This is because an increase of job demand developed during the booming 20s in the North and Midwest, which caused a massive movement of people, typically African Americans, who brought their culture with them. In the years 1922 and 1923, two very influential jazz bands, the New Orleans Rhythm Kings and King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, recorded a number of records in Chicago, helping to make Chicago the jazz place to be. Eventually, during the 20s, New York replaced Chicago and New Orleans as the jazz capital of the U.S. This is due to New York's heavily populated urban community, and because New York was always known as being a major music-producing city. Not to mention, many prominent musicians led a successful career in New York, such as Fletcher Henderson and Paul Whiteman.
Jelly Roll Morton, a famous jazz pianist, grew up in New Orleans. In 1902, he started working in Storyville playing ragtime and other popular dance songs of the era. In 1904, he traveled the country as an itinerant pianist, going to places like New York, Los Angeles, Memphis, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. In 1917 in Los Angeles, he began playing with music with a mixture of ragtime, vocal and instrumental blues, items from minstrel shows, field and levee hollers, religious hymns, and spirituals, with Hispanic music from the Caribbean and white popular songs. This music was a close resemblance of jazz. In 1922, after much success, he moved to Chicago. Here he found great success with recording and working with other musicians as well as performing. In 1928, he moved to New York and continued his career as a successful musician and arranger. During the 1930s, he moved to Washington, D.C. and remained there until his death. Louis Armstrong, a jazz cornet soloist, was born somewhere between 1898 and July 4, 1900 in Storyville, New Orleans. He started to develop his musical talent singing in a local barbershop quartet. However, it was not until he was in the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, where he was sentenced for delinquency, that he was exposed to the cornet. After he was released, he taught himself songs and rhythms. Joe "the King" Oliver, a cornetist in New Orleans at the time, gave Armstrong a cornet, and later Armstrong replaced him in the leading band of New Orleans. Here is where he perfected his playing and taught himself how to read music. He continued to play in dance halls and riverboats. In 1922, Oliver invited Armstrong to come and play in his popular jazz band, Creole Jazz Band, at Lincoln Garden. People began to notice him. Armstrong perfected swing, an important technique in jazz-style music. In 1924, Armstrong married Lillian Harding, who convinced him to move to New York, where he collaborated with various artists in New Orleans-styled recordings. Chicago in 1925 began a series of 60 recordings where he recorded some of his most famous songs. He continued to play jazz until the shift into swing in the mid-1930s, where he excelled. He died in 1971. Sidney Bechet, a jazz saxophonist and clarinetist, was born to a Creole family in 1897. He was an outstanding jazz soloist. He played the saxophone and was compared to Louis Armstrong with his amazing solos. Self-taught to play the clarinet at a young age, he could never read music. By the age of 12, he was playing with bands in New Orleans. By 1914, he left New Orleans and traveled the South, playing at various small and somewhat large venues. He embarked on a European tour with the Southern Syncopated Orchestra. While in London, he discovered a soprano saxophone. He fell in love with the greater range the saxophone gave him and made that his primary instrument, however still continuing to play the clarinet. In 1919, he left the orchestra and joined a small ragtime band and continued to tour Europe, the United States, and Russia. In 1925, he began working briefly with Duke Ellington Orchestra in New York. From 1923 to 1925, he collaborated with Louis Armstrong in Chicago with New Orleans-style jazz. He eventually moved to France and lived there until his death.
Although many people praise jazz, the 1920s popular music also faced criticism. Not all, but most of the greatest jazz musicians and bands of the 1920s were African Americans. Since America had not accepted African Americans as equal to white people yet, they were not allowed to play in a multitude of proper and respected clubs, even though they were extremely talented. However, less reputable venues owned by gangsters would hire black jazz performers. Many of these venues were speakeasies, or clubs that served alcohol illegally. Because of this, jazz became associated with illicit places like speakeasies and brothels. One of the most popular jazz nightclubs of the Prohibition era was the Cotton Club, formerly known as the Club Deluxe. Located in Harlem, New York City, it was bought by gangster and bootlegger Oni Madden from Jack Johnson in 1922. Jazz also took criticism from the generally aged generations of the audience. These traditionalists preferred classical music and believed that jazz was improper. Some even called it trash. There were also positive effects of jazz's influence on the 1920s. Jazz originated from African Americans and was mostly played by them too. Jazz gained the attention and intrigued many people from the upper class or respected people. With the admiration of these musicians' talents also came respect. Although it was just a minor increase in respect, it was a step towards equality. African Americans used this new respect to give them courage to fight for equal rights in the future and to fight against unjust treatment in New Orleans. Jazz also had a strong influence on women. Jazz was often upbeat and encouraged people to dance. Women's pre-war Victorian clothing was not suitable for dancing. Women's dresses changed entirely. The drop-waist dress was more loosely fit, and the hem was shortened to close to the knee length rather than to the feet. Also, hair was cut shorter, and most women adopted the popular bob hairstyle. Jazz also affected women's role in society. Before the 1920s, women played the role of a traditional housewife. Jazz music provided an outlet for rebellion. At night, women would escape their family role to dance and drink at dance halls, clubs, and speakeasies. The music industry also provided women with jobs. Jazz music played a significant role in shaping society in the 1920s.